Yeah, man, I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man, you just go on there and point and click, get in there, talk about www. Call me, you got that.
For some reason or another, you sounded a little taller on radio.
Well, for my money, he's got all the facial characteristics of a criminal.
Now, here's your host, that gravy sopping, crappie flopping, stump jumping, Bible thumping, gun toting, mater growing son of a gun, the backwoods Baptist himself, Pastor Harold Smith.
Welcome to the Backwoods Baptist Podcast. It's so good to have you on here today, and we've got a good one. I've got my good friend Brandon White.
Morning, Brother Harold.
Current pastor of Indian Mission Baptist Church in Smithville, Oklahoma, till the end of the month.
Yes, sir.
And then you're going to be the pastor of where?
Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Granite Bay, California.
Wow. We got a good discussion coming up. This is unscripted. We don't have anything. He said, what are we talking about? I said, I don't care. We can talk about smoked meats. We can talk about deer hunting. We can talk about whatever he wants to talk about. But it's the Backwoods Baptist Podcast. We're coming to you from 522 Main Street, Backwoods Baptist World Headquarters, the Backwoods Book Company. And we got a pastor's lunch in a couple hours, so preachers will start trickling in. And they'll be making faces at us and trying to get us to break our demeanor. Just don't do it. Ignore them. You too, though. You know, you may be listening and saying, what's a Backwoods Baptist? Well, if mink breeding season affects the attendance of your church, you might be a Backwoods Baptist. I was among some of the finest Backwoods Baptists I've met, and they had a fur farm, and it was mink breeding season, so we had some people out for that because, you know, you got to make mink when the mink are shining. You know what I mean?
Sounds right.
Yeah, they were good folks. I really, really enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to getting to know those folks some more in the future. Anyways, Brandon, let's just start with how you and I met.
Sure.
Do you want to tell that story? And go ahead and let me take a deep breath. I got allergies right now. Every time the cherry trees start to bud out, they don't have to bloom, just start budding out. And we can't decide if it's winter or summer. And then I go north about 3 states and come back. My nose doesn't stop running. So tell the story how we met.
Yeah, if my memory serves me correct, Harold, I think it was a phone call that you made to me. You had been in touch with a preacher from back east with some books you were trying to order, and he talked about how there was a brother named Brandon White in Smithville, Oklahoma. Did you know him? And you didn't. And he said, well, y'all should know each other. And I think he gave you my contact info, and you called me, and we met on the phone first time.
We were, I was putting together a conference.
Yep.
And I was going to try to get every preacher that I knew of that believed the doctrines of grace. That was my only qualifier. And, boy, we got some wackos that first year. So I didn't know you.
Right.
I had contacted Bob Doom because he was the director of Revival Literature, which is one of the ministries he operated. And I was trying to get some books because I wanted to give every pastor some free books.
Right.
So I was trying to buy them to give them away. And he was like, you don't know him? I'm like, no. And I guess he's on his computer or something. He's like, you're not an hour and a half from him. You don't know. I was like, no, I don't. You were in a whole different circle of churches.
Exactly.
And so we didn't know each other. So I called and talked to you on the phone, and I just said, hey, I want you to preach in this meeting we're having. And I didn't know you.
No.
And
you took a big step of faith there,
brother. You turned out better than one of the other guys that preached. Do you remember that guy?
Yeah, I do. I remember him. He never came back either, did he?
Well, I asked him where the nearest church was to him.
Mm-hmm.
He was in extreme southeast Arkansas, or southwest Arkansas, so he was straight south of me. And I said, where's the nearest church to you? And he said, Jackson, Mississippi. And I was like, so there's no churches in South Arkansas or North Louisiana? He goes, oh, no. I said, where's the next nearest church to you? And he said, Joplin, Missouri. Well, you would have to drive past the church you were at, the church I was at, to get to Joplin, Missouri. So I was like, this guy don't even think we're a real church.
Right.
So I got to looking in the church in Joplin, Missouri was like 3 old ladies meeting in a trailer house.
Sounds about right.
Without a pastor. But for some, super special reason, That was the next nearest church to this guy that was south of Texarkana.
They had the proper pedigree.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the funny thing about that, though, was I remember that guy. Do you remember him saying in the sermon that if you and your buddy were out deer hunting and you was saved and he was lost and you accidentally shot him, and you remember this?
I remember.
And you get over there and he's laying there on the ground bleeding. He's like, tell me about Jesus. Did he not say, if you're not a preacher, you don't have the right to tell him that that's a pastor's job or a gospel preacher's job? Isn't that pretty much what he said?
I think you took that scripture out of context, that God chose by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe.
So you should, now if you are a preacher and you shoot a guy, well, man, you ought to throw your gun down, get your Bible out, and find a pulpit.
Jump up on a stump and go to preaching, right?
Don't give an altar call, because that dying man probably can't make it down front. But
that's right.
Golly, that was nuts, man. Like twice, I come real close to just standing up and going, hey, turn his mic off. He's done. He didn't want to wear a mic either.
Oh, he didn't want to be recorded, huh?
No, he had his own microphone and his own recorder. So I went to him with a lapel mic. He said, I don't need that. I said, yeah, you do. He goes, I'm loud enough. And I said, well, we're recording it. He said, I'm recording it. And I said, well, okay, we'll both record it. You don't wear this, you don't preach. I should have right then said, man, get out of here.
Yeah.
You
never know.
Yeah, I was 50-50, and you were on the good 50.
I'm glad I was on the good side.
Yeah, and then we've become good friends since then.
Yes, sir.
I mean, we got a lot of sharing interests. We do a lot of the same things. If we were closer together, we probably wouldn't be. You would probably have a negative influence on me.
Yeah, probably so.
Before you preach through Romans 13. Yeah.
Yep. Well, those days have come to an end since I've come to see the light, Brother Harold.
Well, that's one of the funniest stories.
That's another good story, yeah.
Yeah, why don't you start that story? Why don't you just tell it? You were,
yeah.
I mean.
So we're having a revival meeting there at Indian Mission. Brother Terry Oswald.
That's right.
You had brought Michael Sanchez down. Was that the first time Michael
First time he'd ever been to your church.
Yep, first time. And so y'all had come down for service. It was in the fall. And we're actually breaking ground on the new Three Rivers business. And one of the young men of the church said that they'd been having deer out there on that freshly broken up ground every night. And so here we've come to the end of the service. Terry's a big hunter. Every man in the church is a big hunter. I'm a big hunter. And if you're in southeast Oklahoma or even in western Arkansas, you tote a gun in your truck when it's deer season. And
yeah, it don't come out from deer season to deer season. It's just always in the cab.
It's in the cab because you never know what you might see. And so service is over. Y'all are fixing to leave. And I asked if you brought a light and a gun with you for any deer you might see on the way home. And what was your response, Harold?
I said, no, sir, we're Christians.
And you could have heard a pin drop.
I'm telling you, people in the church went, whoa. I mean, I could hear like people kind of like, huh, what? And I mean, people in front of me were like turning around, looking back, like, who is that guy back there? Who said that? And I thought it was funny to say, oh no, we're Christians, because I thought you were just kidding. But no, I insulted everyone in the whole congregation.
I think Michael took a sidestep away from you.
He did.
He wanted to put a little distance between you.
He would have gladly joined in, you know. Michael's like, I didn't ride down here with him. But that was a good time for Michael, because Michael had, you know, that's one of the things I would say I really have learned from you is what I would call a fuller understanding of the Holy Spirit in worship. I think that's something that you gleaned in Western North Carolina, where you grew up at.
Yes, sir.
I mean, you didn't start out in Smithville, Oklahoma.
Nope.
No, you came out here to do Native American mission work, right? That was the original reason for coming here.
That was the original reason, yep.
And but you had an understanding of the Holy Spirit. You had probably more liberty in worship than I was enjoying and experiencing. And so when we got together, you weren't even the pastor at Indian Mission then. You were still working under Raymond Johnson.
That's right.
And so I had been to a few services there over the years. Raymond would have me come down and preach like maybe a jubilee. I
think then it was mission conference.
It was a mission conference.
But it was just like a Saturday only.
Yeah, it was a Saturday, and there would be 3 or 4 preachers, and he'd have somebody come in from off. And then I think I preached there a few times, like for New Year's Eve. I think we had a few watch night services there early on. And I just didn't really see anything. And then you took over as pastor, and there was a noticeable change in the worship service. And I thought, man, this is what I like. This is in my mind, we were a little too starchy, you know, a little too regulated, if you want to use that word.
Yep.
And when you would bring in men for revival meetings or Jubilees, what you end up calling it.
Yep.
You would bring in guys from out east that you knew and had a long experience with, and then other preachers would follow and come stay during the meeting and celebrate another year of the church. And I began to just handpick a few guys that I knew and go, man, you might benefit from this.
Yes, sir.
And I think all but one of those guys became a regular partaker in the Jubilee services.
Yeah, you know, Jubilee, it started in 2019, which was the 50th year anniversary of the actual start of the mission that became Indian Mission Baptist Church.
Okay.
And so that was kind of the reason for the name change. And I'd preached a message to the church there on the year of Jubilee in the Old Testament and all that entailed. But whenever we changed that, we celebrated that 50 year, we put a sign up, kind of given the history of the church. We honored some of the charter members and also Brother Harjo, who had started the work. But that was when we kind of changed it from a mission conference, solely missionary, missions-based meeting to Jubilee.
And I want to say something. The missions conference wasn't bad. I met Cecil Fayard through that. I met some good missionaries over the years through that. But the transition to Jubilee, what you're talking about right here, was it was a changing event for me. I mean, it changed the way I view worship today. Yeah. So go ahead.
And it was really important for me. I wanted to take the church to that place of worship, right? And by that, I know we worship. It's an attitude of the heart, right? But it's expressed in our praise to God. And I know in any given church service, you're not going to have it a blowout service, like we might say. It's not going to be up here all the time, and that's okay. But I want at least to have the potential for it to go there. If God sits in and starts speaking to the hearts of his people through the preaching of his word, and they begin to swell up with emotion or weep or raise their hand or say amen, or however they respond to God in that atmosphere of worship, that's between them and God. There's no pressure put on anybody to be any certain way. But I wanted there to be at least a potential. And with Jubilee, it went from just a main focus on missions to, missions, but I want our focus on Christ.
Yeah.
And just like they said I think it's in the Gospel of John, isn't it, when they said, sirs, we would see Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's what I've tried to emphasize with Jubilee, was just preach to us what God lays on your heart, but in that, magnify the Lord.
Right.
And sometimes you get a mission message. I think we had some of that this year. And so, but God's blessed that. But God blessed it too. I mean, you've been a big influence. I think this year I counted, we had over 35 preachers in that meeting. Yeah. Now, when it first started, we had like 9 or 10.
Yeah.
So,
let's talk about that meeting. When we say a meeting, it's starting on Sunday morning and running through Thursday night.
Thursday night, yep.
And you're housing everybody.
Yep.
And feeding everybody.
Yeah.
And covering a lot of them's expenses to get there.
Yep.
And you're doing it in a town without a motel within 30-minute drive.
Yes, sir.
And everybody's got a place to sleep and stay. That's amazing.
Well, and it's a testimony to God's goodness. Over the years of living there, we were able to make contacts with guys who have rental cabins, and so that comes into play. You know, the church has got the vision for it, and so they're willing to spend the money to take care of the meals. You know, even guys that didn't preach this year, we tried to give them at least $100 to help them with their fuel, just for coming.
Right.
You know, we want it to be an oasis. We don't want it to be one of these like big conferences where you pay us to come, and then we'll let you, sit and hear some preaching.
We'll let you hear some experts in preaching.
Yeah, the experts. So, and I've been to some of those conferences and I've benefited, but I feel like that's getting off track. We ought to be trying to be hospitable, love people. You can't outgive God, and so you teach a church to give, bring people in, and just shower them with love. And then they not only are blessed physically, but then they're blessed spiritually. And they don't leave with a financial burden of having to have come to that meeting, and now they're going to have to recoup somehow what they lost just to come.
Yeah, and a lot of those men that you have come there are evangelists who, if they're not preaching somewhere, there's
That's right.
no income, a lot of them,
Right.
So for them to take a week out of their schedule, drive 2 or 3 states away,
Yep.
and it's a loss of revenue. I mean, we know guys don't preach for the money, but
it takes money.
It takes money.
To be able to go.
Yeah,
and
you got
preach.
to put
Sure.
you got to put gas in the tank to get there.
Well, and then one reason I said all that was, as God built this meeting, He used you in bringing these guys, like you said. Like, I think probably out of the 35 preachers there this year, and at least 12 or 15 of them are guys that I've met through you, who've started coming to the meeting, and like you said, it's become a highlight for them. Yeah. They get help, and now they're preaching in the meeting, and so they're helping other people too. Yeah. And I've got people coming to me like who heard Wes Brown preach this year or Ronnie Qualls preach, and they're like, "Man, these guys are just tremendous preachers." And I'm like, yeah, they are.
Yeah, and you've preached in the meeting that I used to hold every year. You've preached in it many times. When we had the Preachers of Grace meeting, the first you preached in the first meeting.
Yep.
And you preached in, I think we had that 11 or 12 years. And you preached probably half of those years.
Yes, sir.
And we only had 10 preachers. I mean, we crammed it all in like 2.5 days.
Right.
We had 10 preachers. We might have 60 people in attendance.
Oh yeah.
So I couldn't preach everybody. No. I just didn't have the. I don't know what you say. I just didn't have the space to preach 60 guys.
Didn't have enough slots.
Yeah.
And you wish you could.
Yeah.
But
during that, I had probably a more diversified group of preachers.
Oh yeah.
But I also had a more centralized group of preachers in that most of the guys were from Arkansas and Oklahoma, just nobody drove more than a couple hours to get there. A handful of guys would, but
right.
The thing that I enjoy about Jubilee is there would be guys there from Virginia, Kentucky, North Carolina, Georgia, South Carolina. You might have somebody there from Ohio or Illinois, or
and now they're coming from Idaho.
Idaho, yeah. There's quite a crowd comes from Idaho.
There's a big crowd that comes from there. So.
And but I mean, I'm just not going to bump into them guys.
Sure.
If I go to a meeting in Conway or Little Rock, I'll probably see a lot of the guys from my old conference there.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to bump into those guys from Idaho anywhere.
Right.
I'm not going to bump into those guys from North Carolina anywhere because I just don't get there. And so for me, when I would show up at Jubilee, I'm like, man, I'm ready to see this guy or that guy. I want to know how he's doing.
Yeah.
I want to catch up.
Yep.
And I just, but we talked about the worship there. One of the things that I struggled with was the way that we have prayer meeting before the service. I mean, I used to dodge and duck it. I couldn't do it, man.
Yeah.
And when we first started doing it, there was only like 5 or 6 guys in a room. We could all fit in one a small Sunday school class, a closet.
Right. Yep. It was, yeah.
I mean, it was much more than a closet the first few years.
That's right.
It would be 5 or 6 guys. And so we were talking about prayer requests and said, all right, let's pray. And so I was going to silently pray, and everybody in the room opened up praying. And I thought, I'm trying to pray over here, man. I can't pray over the top of you guys, And I'd never done that. Well, I had. Right. I'd seen it in some Native American churches.
Okay.
In Tahlequah.
Okay.
That was the first time I'd ever experienced anything like that, and I was like, I don't like this. Well, as the meeting got bigger, there was 20 guys in a room, a bigger room. And, man, I just couldn't focus and pray. And I was like, I don't think this is right. And we got a mutual friend, much closer to you than he is me. But I talked to Randy Bain about it. I was like, man, I don't like it. And he goes, why not? You don't like hearing men pray to God? And I was like, well, you say it like that, it makes me feel like I'm unspiritual. And he said, well, God can hear y'all praying silently. He can hear y'all praying out loud. And he said, man, just go in there and pray. Quit. And I never been in that environment. Yeah. And then over the years, I was like, no, I kind of look forward to Now we do it outside the last few years because there's not a room big enough to hold us.
Right. Be like 50 men circled up out
50
there.
men in a circle praying outside on the side of the highway.
Right on the highway, too.
Yeah, people driving by. And, I mean, you don't pray for show.
No.
I mean, clearly that's forbidden.
Yep.
But you can't, where else could 50 men go and not, and stay within earshot of the church? So
I've often wondered what kind of testimony that might be to somebody driving by, Here's some men actually praying.
Don't go in that church. They take it serious.
That's right. So, yeah, that's how we grew up praying. And I guess a lot of guys would always take it from, Acts 1, they're in the upper room praying in one accord. Yeah. And that's how they would interpret that scripture. And so you'd have every man just basically praying. And I know there can become times when there's competition in that, but I know growing up, most of the time, that was never the sense. It was never competition. It was just how they did it in the mountains, and they prayed and called on God together. And I introduced that here, and it was a little different. But
well, I mean,
it caught on.
I got over it, got onto it, and enjoy it.
Yes, sir.
And it's one of those things that I really, I guess, if you were to call on me to pray in church. Mm-hmm. I would get up and probably pray for three basic things. I would pray for the singing, the fellowship, and the preaching.
Yep. And
that's typically the outline that runs through my mind when we're gathered in a church service. If it's the end of the service, I usually thank the Lord for what we've heard. Mm-hmm. Help us apply what we've heard. Be with us as we go home. Help us to live out these truths. Something along those lines.
Yep.
But to hear other men praying out loud, not as though they're the only guy up there and they've just got to give some textbook, stock prayer.
Yep.
Just to hear men and the things they pray for. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, it's benefited me. And at first it really bothered me, and I got over it, and I really think it's helped my prayer life a bunch.
And to that point, I was just sitting here thinking, I think that's how men learn to pray too, right? Being younger and hearing older men like Randy that you mentioned and other men, hearing them pray out loud like that taught me how to pray.
Yeah. And a lot of times if all you're hearing other people do is public prayer, what I would call public prayer,
it is more polished.
Well, I know guys that get up and they can barely speak English and they get up and pray in the King James. O thou fatherst in heaven, we come before you and humble hands.
They have a totally different voice and tone.
Like, who in the world is praying? And matter of fact, I had a guy tell me one time that's how he knew tongues was real.
Oh, really?
I said, how you know that's what the Lord said? He goes, because this lady, when she spoke in tongues, she always spoke King James.
Oh, wow.
And I said, that's how you know it was real? He goes, she couldn't speak King James unless the Holy Ghost was on her. Well, a lot of people, when they pray, they just start dropping all these big King James words. And I'm like, no, that's not real prayer, But when you pray in a circle with a group of men that are not the one guy praying, they're just all praying, you hear men talking to God in a more, I don't know, fatherly way and a more relational way.
At least a more genuine way, right?
Yeah, it's not the just kind of superficial, and
that's a good word, yeah. And a lot of it can be that.
You're right. And I've always said we're not to make a spectacle out of public prayer. When we read what Christ's words are there in the Sermon on the Mount, about chapter, I think that's 6, where he gives what we call the Lord's Prayer, but he says, when you pray, go in the closet.
Yeah.
Yeah, don't do it on the street corners where everybody can hear it. And I know people that go into restaurants and say, let's pray, and just thunder this prayer across a loud restaurant, like everybody in there needs to hear it. But when you pray in that circle, you got 50 men praying to an audience of one, and it's beneficial. That's one of the elements of worship that I think I've really gleaned from you over the years. Another is freedom in singing. And the emphasis on singing. It's not in a lot of churches, it can become a performance. It's very good. Sure. The singers are professionally trained. The musicians are some of the finest around, and all that's great and nice, you know. But for you to get all the youth choir up there, all the kids from 5 years old, or Sam when he's, 3?
Yeah.
So a 3-year-old to a 17, 18-year-old senior, and a couple of ladies that work with them, and they all get up there and they spread out and they start singing, and it's from the heart. Right. I mean, I'm like, and I know churches that are like, oh, you can't do that. It's all congregational, or it's nothing. I'm like, bro, shut up. I want to watch kids sing about Jesus. Yeah. You know what I mean?
And it's a joy.
Yeah.
They're up there grinning ear to ear, and they're belting it out.
Yeah, and some of them are thinking about what they're singing, you know, and you can tell it's having an impact on them.
Yep.
If you don't believe in emotion and worship, I don't think you know what worship is.
I think you're right. Some people confuse the two, and they think emotionalism is worship, and I don't agree with that. But true, genuine worship will have an impact on your emotions.
Yes.
Yeah. It'll stir you. You know, and to your point about singing groups, I think one year, 2 or 3 years ago maybe, I had a singing group come in, and they were good, and they're probably better than most. But then they couldn't come back the next year, and they haven't been back since. Their schedule won't allow it. But I almost think God let that happen on purpose.
Yeah.
Because you can get to where you have these groups coming, and you know how this is. You'll have more people come because of the singing group than because of who's there preaching.
Yeah.
And I think that was God's providence in keeping us from going in a direction that would put the emphasis on these groups instead of on the Lord. And when you have a little quartet, or you have a youth choir, and it's people that they've not done this all their life, they're not professional musicians, they're just getting up to sing to the Lord. Right. God honors that. And there's an atmosphere there of God's presence in that kind of singing.
Yeah, I don't know. I think about the singing there, and when I was pastor at Lee Creek, we had 4 piano players at one time.
Yep.
And they all argued over who got to play the piano. One of them could play the organ, so she was always piano or organ. The other 3 was like, it's my turn. No, you played last week. It was that kind of stuff. And there was a lot of piano and not a lot of singing. Mm-hmm. And the guy that led the singing was a great guy, and he sang from the heart and was loud, but everybody else was just like, shall we gather at the river? You know, they're just kind of mumbling through it. And then we went from 4 piano players to no piano player.
Yep.
And no song leader. The song leader left with the piano players. And all of a sudden, we had nobody to lead worship, you know? And I was trying to lead worship, and I can't sing. My wife she can really sing. She got up and led worship a few times, but I knew that wasn't ideal. Then God sent us Ron Newby. And when Ron Newby came along, he just got up and sang in his own voice, which was a little lower than the way they were written. He can't sing the high notes, but he sang.
Oh, yeah.
And he sang loud. And we didn't have any musical accompaniment. So then I would just tell the people, look, if y'all don't sing, God's not going to be praised. You can't mumble behind a loud piano.
That's right.
And we learned to sing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we sang loud. And when people would visit our church, they were like, boy, I put y'all up against any Church of Christ choir, man. Y'all can sing. And we just learned to harmonize. But Ron singing lower, all the men didn't have to, screech to get up there where they needed to be.
That's right.
And it just worked. It just flowed, and it was wonderful. And then when we added a piano into it, it was just fuller. And the thing about the Jubilee services is the singing. When you got that many pastors who have taken a week off to devote to drawing close to the Lord, to celebrating, to worship morning and evening, to prayer, to fellowship with the saints.
Yep.
When you come with that burden on your heart, and they announce a song that you've sang since you was 4 years old, you don't have to look at your hymnal. You just rear back and sing it.
That's right. And
you take good musicians that can play, the piano or the guitar. The guys play guitar. The singing's so loud.
Yeah.
You can sing as loud as you want. And you can't hear yourself sing.
You don't have to worry about being off key.
No.
Off tune.
I've been in churches where one guy got happy and started singing, and I'm like, man, who's got the alley cat back here? It was awful.
Yeah.
And but you could hear him in that kind of an environment, dude. You could twist the tail off on an alley cat, nobody'd even hear it, man.
That's right.
I mean, but I don't know. I just I enjoy Jubilee. I enjoy the worship. It's taught me a lot. And really through you've introduced me to a lot of guys that have been really beneficial and helpful to me. I remember when we you and I got together and brought Tom Gillum in. Mm-hmm. And I'd met Tom in Georgia at Richard Kleiner's
That's
meeting.
right. Yeah.
That was where I met Bob Doom for the first time in person, the guy that put us together. And when I went out there, you said, hey, he's going to have this guy named Tom Gillum preach. You need to listen to him. And so I was anticipating, and I'm watching this kind of, plump-looking older fella just kind of walking slow and stooped over, and I'm like, this is the guy Brandon told me to listen up for. I'm like, what in the world? And he didn't get up and light the pulpit on fire, but he pointed out some things in the Bible that I had never seen before. Yeah. And every time he preached, he did that.
Yes, sir.
And I said, okay, here's a guy that's been with the Lord.
Yeah, that's it. Yep.
And, you've brought him in year after year.
Yeah.
Of course, they wasn't able to be there this year, but you introduced me. You kind of set the stage like you need to pay attention to this guy. Mm-hmm. And he's been a blessing to me, and in turn, I've introduced him to a lot of other preachers.
Yeah. He's preached for Michael Sanchez.
Preached for Wade Lentz 2 or 3 times.
Yep.
Yep. But there again, you introduced me to Randy Bain. He's been very influential to me. Yeah. I don't see him a lot just because his schedule and mine. Right. He lives in North Carolina. I live in Arkansas, but we talk on the phone pretty regular. Yep. And being a independent missionary like I am, not attached to any group, I've learned a lot of practical things from Randy. Oh, yeah. How do you handle this? How do you do this? And Randy's not a traditional missionary. He calls himself a missionary evangelist. He preaches a lot of revival meetings, but then he might turn around and go to Australia for a month. Right. Or the Amazon for 3 weeks or something. But I've just gleaned a lot from him. I've even stayed in his home a few times and spent some extended time with him, and that's been a blessing. And then probably the best thing that you've ever introduced me to was Brandon Harrell. Oh, man, I'm sorry. I should have introduced you to him with a disclaimer. Man, he's a unique brother. He is unique, man. And the funny thing about him was he was pastoring, what's the name of that church? Bethsaida or where he pastored at? I said it wrong, didn't I? Yeah, Bethesda. Bethesda, Bethesda, Maryland. Yep. Okay, he was pastoring Bethesda. Mm-hmm. Where's that, Flat Rock? Flat Rock, East Flat Rock, yeah. East Flat Rock. Mm-hmm. Okay, he was pastoring there and been there 10 or 12 years. And I was pastoring at Lee Creek and had been there 14, and I was going to step down to go into this ministry. I had a real short list of guys that I thought, might be a good fit at Lee Creek, and he was feeling led out of the pastorate, and so I called him up, and I thought, boy, this would just be great. Will just Brandon Harrell just slide right out and get over here on the western Arkansas and be closer to you and me, and we'll just have a great time. And he prayed about it, and he came back, and he said, brother, I can't do that. And I said, what's the matter? Is it the money? I mean, what this was a slam dunk fit, and he said, no. He said, that's just not what the Lord wants me to do. And then it was like 2 weeks later, he figured out why. Right. Our friend Bob Doom had passed away, the director of Global Baptist Mission, the Russian Bible Society, Revival Literature. Brandon Harrell had worked in that ministry, and now they needed somebody to come in and be the assistant director. And he and I basically ended up out traveling preachers, for lack of a better word. Yeah. At the same time. Exactly. And both of us walking out of a pastorate with no support, trying to raise support, trying to do the jobs the Lord's called us to do. But Brandon Harrell has been a real blessing. I mean, he stayed here in the bookstore. Yeah. Just a few weeks ago, wasn't it? Just a few weeks ago when he did a revival for Gary Fitzpatrick before Jubilee. But I come in here one day to drop off some stuff in the office, and he's in the back. And so I thought I'll just slip in the front door and drop some stuff off and won't bother him. I opened that front door up, and he was up here making coffee in the Keurig when he heard that door pop open, I mean, he popped his head around there, bug-eyed. I think he thought somebody was breaking in on him. He was in his pajamas. And I said, man, you can take that back to your bedroom and just, oh, no, I'll do it up here. And so he'd come up here and make him 3 or 4 cups of coffee every morning. I think that's what he runs on is coffee.
Yeah.
But I've enjoyed getting to know him. And
he's never met a stranger.
no, not at all. And he's never at a loss for words either. I mean.
Nope. He's a dear brother. You can fellowship with him. You can glean from him. And you'll laugh with him.
Oh.
He's going to have you rolling in the floor at some point if you're in any kind of a lengthy conversation.
Oh, man. He's going to have you laughing. and he's a tremendous preacher. I mean, he does a good job.
He is. It's amazing me how many doors have opened for him out this way relatively quickly and in a short span of time. I mean, he's been with Alan Nelson. He's been with Michael Sanchez. He was with Brother Wes Brown,
Jeremy
Brother Gary,
Williams.
Jeremy Williams.
Yeah. He's preaching for Clint Vernon up in Heber Springs later this year.
Okay.
But I preached him the last 2 years of Preachers of Grace.
Mm-hmm.
And he donated books.
That's right, yep.
And so we had 50 to 60 preachers those last couple of years. So you had a lot of guys that got to hear him, know him, laugh with him.
That's right.
And then a lot of those guys about that time started going to Jubilee.
Yep.
And so they was tied back in. And I promote guys that I agree with, guys that I have a high view of.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of preachers, because I know so many preachers, pastors will call me and they'll say, hey, man, I'm thinking about putting on a meeting. I'm like, okay, what do you want to do? And they'll ask my opinion. You know, they'll give me the topic or the theme, and they'll say, who do you think would be good to, cover this topic or that topic or maybe for the whole week?
Yeah.
And I try to recommend guys based on my knowledge and experience, and I recommend him a lot.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody out on the left coast calls me and wants to plan a meeting, I know one guy out there I can recommend.
I don't know who is that. Oh my, it's still hard to.
What's the
fathom.
logistics? I mean, are you going to put Granny Clampett in a rocking chair and strap her to the top of your Suburban and the coon dog and the shotgun, and you're going to drive out there like Jed and the family?
I'm still waiting to strike liquid gold, brother. But no, yeah, we have basically U-Haul has what their version of the pods company, but pods aren't available where we live. So U-Haul boxes is what they call them. They're an 8 by 5 by 7 foot box. You pick it up on a trailer. We're going to haul it down to the house. We're going to get 3 of them, fill them up, and then they ship them out for us. So all of our belongings will be shipped for us that route. We're going to be at Indian Mission through the last Sunday in March. I told them I'd be with them through the end of March. And then from there, we're going to go back to North Carolina and Georgia for about a week to see our family, both sides, mine and Emily's. She's going to stay with her mom there and fly out to California from there because her mom can take her to the airport. Just makes sense. They'll get a little more time together with the family. Right. I'll drive back, and then from here I'll drive out. And one of the men in the church. She taking
the kids with her?
Yeah, she's keeping the kids.
Okay.
So we talked about doing a long road trip, all the family, but the kids are so small still. I don't think they'd appreciate it, and we'd be ready to pull our hair out by the time we got there.
You've got 4 kids, 3 girls and a boy. What's their ages?
Yeah, you got 2, 5, 8, and 10.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we're not ready to tackle that just yet. Mom's going to fly them out, and one of them in the church here is going to help me drive the other vehicle out. And so our plan is to be out there by Easter Sunday in April. Hey. That's the 3rd Sunday of April. So,
yeah, that'll work out good.
Yeah.
That's good. I just can't imagine moving that far with 4 little kids, man.
I know.
I mean, both of my kids are out of the house now. You know, my son's married. My daughter's had her own place for years, but just the amount of junk I've accumulated.
Oh, yeah. I'm still coming to grips with it. I've told people it's amazing how much stuff you can accumulate in 16 years, and that's how long I've been here, since 2009, 16 years in May. Well, so not quite 16 years when we leave. But, yeah, I've made several trips to the dump. My wife, she has gotten Facebook Marketplace happy, and she's been selling stuff. I come in one night, and she's like, well, enjoy your final meal on the dining room table because I sold it, and they're coming tomorrow to pick it up.
Really?
I'm like, well, where are we going to eat from now on? She's that paper plate in the chair. So, but a lot of stuff like that we don't need, or it's cheaper not to ship it and just buy it when we get there.
Right.
Yep.
Well, what'd you do? Just saw them deer horns off your deer heads and make knife handles out of them, give them away?
No, we're taking the deer heads with us. So
that'll be a foreign animal to them out there.
it probably will be. They don't have whitetail.
I hope they don't confiscate it at the border. I hope you can import that.
That's what I'm hoping. I'm just hoping they don't need to see any verification of tags where they were killed. I do have them. I just don't know where they're at.
Oh, man, that's funny.
We'll find out. They got blacktail there and mule deer, so they're used to it. We're moving to. They're a little more conservative. So,
well, one of the things I think we ought to cover is, and we should have done it earlier, but I was just sitting here. We've been talking a lot about Western North Carolina, and you kind of alluded to it. I was talking about prayer. Mm-hmm. Talk about your entrance into the ministry.
Okay.
Your brother Justin, who's another guy I've met through you and really enjoy and appreciate, that lives back where you came from. And both of you are pastors.
Yep.
And both tremendous preachers. And you grew up in kind of all of you about the same age, within a few years of each other. And talk about that. I mean, I've heard you talk about it some.
Sure.
But I want you to share it with people, you know, how that all came to pass.
Yeah. Well, my brother and I, we grew up in a little church called Crossroads Baptist Church in Zirconia, North Carolina. Ironically, only probably 10 miles from where Randy Bain lives.
Yeah, I started to say, I know where that's at.
Yeah. And then his son, David Bain. Brandon Harrell, who we've already talked about, he moved to the area that the church was in, and he moved in with his dad. His dad was a member of the church there, and so I think when he was 9 or 10, he started coming to Crossroads. So he, my brother, myself, we hung out every weekend growing up, and we'd hang out at his house and tell ghost stories until 2 a.m, and then we were scared to drive home because you had to drive home through the Green River watershed, and we just knew that some boogeyman was going to jump out of the trees and get us, you know. So, but we had a good time. We spent a lot of time together, a lot of stories we could tell. But, you know, we grew up it was a Southern Baptist church in name only. They weren't affiliated with the association. In fact, they were one of the founding members of that particular association from back in the early or mid 1800s.
Right.
The church itself predated the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so they traced their roots back to the Sandy Creek Association, Shubal Stearns, and
well, about every church around there
basically
ends
every church
up on
around
that
there.
one. Yeah.
Exactly. And that being the case, so they weren't your, you know, independent, fundamental, you know, fighting Baptist, but they weren't your extreme liberal like some Southern Baptist churches preaching
in a Hawaii 5-0 shirt, a pair of shorts and flip flops.
Nope. And so we grew up. I feel like it was a pretty good balance where we grew up. And sadly, like most churches of that day, they went through preachers like most people go through underwear. Every 2 or 3 years, they'd throw them out the door and get them a new one. But in that, they had guys come through there that believed in a big God.
Yeah.
So we grew up here in big God theology, even though we didn't hear it in term. It was just in substance.
Right.
And I was saved when I was 13. I went off to college for a year, and during that year,
not when you were 13.
No.
A couple of years went by after salvation in college.
I was hoping you wouldn't point that out. People think my IQ is a little higher than it really is. No, saved at 13, finished out my high school days. I played football, had opportunity to go play in a D3 school. Wasn't a big school, but out in Fayetteville, North Carolina. So I went to do that when I was 18. And I came home for spring break, and while I was home at spring break, I met a young man by the name of David Bain. And so
you hadn't really met David until
I'd never met him. No.
And they didn't live 5-10 miles from where you was at.
And literally their church 2 miles from our church.
Yeah.
We drove by it all the time.
Yeah, I've one of the times I stayed with Randy, we got in a side-by-side, Matthew Morgan side-by-side.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, I'm just going to show you around. So we hit the roads and rode around, and he pointed out church after church after church. I mean, we literally were on a side-by-side, could probably count 5 or 6 churches.
Oh, yeah.
In that area.
Real easy.
Yeah. And just a little loop. And he lives in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I thought, my stars, where do the people come from to go to the churches? Yep. And they weren't run down closed buildings. They were all in good shape and thriving churures.
Oh, the church I grew up in, in that day and age, they were running pretty easily 100, 120 folk, but that was given. That's common in the churches around there. In fact, not to go backwards in the story, but when I was saved at 13, it was a revival meeting that Crossroads Baptist, Zion Hill Baptist, and Bob's Creek Baptist churches, all of them within about a 10-mile radius of each other, had decided that they were going to do a 6-week revival meeting.
6-week?
6-week revival meeting. First 2 weeks would be at Crossroads, and one of the other preachers of the other churches would preach it. The next 2 weeks at Zion Hill, and the other pastor of one of the churches preach it.
No way.
And then the last 2 weeks at Bob's Creek, and then the other pastor would preach it.
Most of the local Baptist preachers I know don't have 2 weeks of sermons in them.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was in the second week
at somebody
Crossroads at our church. But Brother Roy Waldrop, he's a pastor at Fletcher First Baptist, has been for years, faithful brother. His son Darren Waldrop was the pastor at Zion Hill, and he was the preacher in that meeting. And he was preaching when the Lord saved me. And so I wanted to tell that story because that's pretty unique how that meeting was, and then the Lord used that. And
was there several professions of faith
there
during that time?
There were quite a few, yeah. And
so I didn't mean to back up. I just assumed you had known David Bain all this growing up because of your proximity and age and living in the area. Okay, so you meet him after you.
I'm in college. I'm back for spring break. And he has just surrendered to preach earlier that year. So in January, it's now March, April. And I'm back for spring break visiting my family, and my mom says, our church is going to a youth service, and you're going. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm home on spring break, Mom. I'm a
college kid now. You're not going to tell me what to do.
But of course, my mom didn't pull no punches. She's like, yeah, you are. You live under my roof. You go by my rules. And that's the way it should be. And so I went. I met David Bain that night. He wasn't even preaching, but he had another guy that he knew come in and preach. That's how we met. And he told me then, he said, hey, we're going to be having a tent meeting this summer, and it's going to be a week-long meeting, and, man, I'd really love for you to come. He reached out. He tried to befriend me, and I remember that, and, it made an impact. And I seen in him and in some of these other young people a real desire and a longing to serve God and go with God in a culture where all the young people were doing the exact opposite.
Right.
And I'd always had those longings as a younger man. I was saved at 13. I tried to read my Bible. I didn't have a lot of discipleship in my life, so I had kind of drawn back from that. And so seeing that there was that life in me that the Spirit of God had put in me that wanted it. So I go back to college, and I'm literally, it's like 2 weeks later, fixing to be packing bags and going home for the summer. I'm sitting on the end of my bed. And it's like the Holy Ghost just out of nowhere spoke to my heart. And I know he doesn't speak to us verbally, Brother Harold, but we're on the same page.
He can if he wants to.
He can if he wants to. But he spoke to my heart, and he said in no uncertain terms, what have you done for me lately? And it was like a load of bricks hit me. And I had to sit there, and I had to look at myself and come to grips with the fact that I'd not done anything. I'd been living selfishly. I wanted to be a football coach when I graduated. I wanted to play football in college. The American dream, that's what I was focused on, and that's where I was headed. And that stopped me dead in my tracks. And I kid you not 5 minutes after this, I'm sitting there weeping on the edge of my bed.
Yeah.
My phone rings, and it's David Bain calling me.
Are you serious?
And we hadn't talked since that youth meeting, but he'd got my number from my mom. And he's like, hey, I just had you on my heart, and I wanted to call and see how you're doing. And I'm like, man, God's got to be in this, And we get to talking. He was really encouraging, and he's like, man, I really want you to come to that youth or that tent meeting that we're going to have. And I'm like, I'm at that point. God's got me where he wants me to be.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, I'll be there. And so went back for the summer, and sure enough, they had that it was right after we got out of college. It was in the end of May, and first week, man, God was moving. And I was hearing preaching like I'd never heard before. At least it was coming alive. So it was David and Randy. And one night Randy preached, the next night David preached, the next night and they went in tandem like that, just swapping back and forth night after night. And you could feel the meeting building. I mean, I look back on it and know that's what it was now. I wasn't as familiar with it then, but it was building. And Thursday night, David preached. I believe that's right. And had asked everybody in the tent that would be willing to do so, would they covenant together to fast and pray Friday and see what God did Friday night in the service, and whether or not God would have the meeting to continue on or just go ahead and shut down after a week. It was a tent meeting. They'd set a big tent up. And I think there was like 20, 25 people from the ages of like 13 up to 90. There's a 90-year-old that agreed to do this. And that Friday night, God moved, and there was like 2 young men surrendered to preach. A couple of people got saved. I'm in the altar just bawling my eyes out because God's working me over, and I'm getting back to where I needed to be for a long time. And so they believed that was God's stamp of approval on the meeting and that it should continue on. And so that meeting ended up going and it's scheduled one week. It went 7 weeks in a row every night.
Really?
And during that time, God let me see things, experience things, hear things from the pulpit being preached that I'd never had a steady diet of. I'd maybe heard a little bit here, a little bit there, but here it's all together in one package.
It was every night because you were going just bam, bam, bam.
And then it got to where young people were getting hungry for God and folk getting saved. And so after the services, they would have prayer meetings. We'd go to the fellowship hall of the church that was hosting the meeting, and we'd pray for an hour or two. I'd never done that. Like at first it was hard. I ran out of things to pray about.
5 minutes in, I'm like,
minutes.
well, what are we doing?
But then as you hear other people praying, and we talked about that earlier, you're learning to pray, and then and man, God was just blessing that and moving. So during this time, my brother Justin, he's never been saved. He had false professions. He was we like to tease him, but him and Brandon Harrell both, they love going to the pool hall. They were pool sharks. They get down there, try to hustle people for their money, lose a few games on purpose, and then take them for everything. But they were good at what they did and came to play in pool. But he was coming into the meeting, and if you ever ask him, he'll share it. And I think he even did during the sermon that he preached a little bit. But God just using his people to love him into the family. And he kept coming. I was praying for him. And, man, God saved my brother during that meeting. He called me to preach. Really, he called me to preach in that meeting, but I was too scared to surrender to it.
Yeah. You didn't want to tell anybody.
I didn't want to tell anybody, and I'll be honest, I was scared, like legitimately. I looked at men like Randy Bain and David Bain and the gifts they had, and I'm like, man, I can't do what they're doing. There's no way. And my genuine biggest fear was, Lord, if I get into this and I mess it up, I'm going to bring a reproach upon your name. Yeah. I'm not like some of these guys who say they didn't want to do it and they ran from it. I wanted to do it. I'd be driving down the road in my old 75 CJ5 Jeep is jacked up with 35-inch super swampers, and I had fog lights and spotlights, and I wish I still had that Jeep.
I started to say, man, stop talking. I want one.
And I'd be driving down the road preaching to myself, sermons coming to my mind, to my heart, and just, again, trying to run from it because of my fear that, well, Lord, if I mess this up, I don't want to bring a reproach upon your name, and I'm not gifted like these other men. But I got to a point after that meeting where I had to know. I already knew, but I needed confirmation. And I'd heard these people talk about, well, God speaks to you through his word. I said, well, Lord, I need a word then. So I got to praying, and I was serious. And I opened my Bible, and it may not work like this all the time for everybody, but it fell to John 15:16. And that's been my ministry verse ever since. You've not chosen me, but I've chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit. And that whatsoever you ask in the Father's name, he'll give it unto thee. Yeah. And, that settled it right there. I had the word of God on it. I knew in my heart already, but God's word just confirmed it. So next Sunday I surrendered to preach. And my pastor told me that the next Sunday after that I'd be preaching my first sermon. And then another church called, and they said that Sunday night I'd be preaching my second sermon.
So that was at Crossroads where you grew up. You went back in there.
Went back in there. I announced my call, and I preached there the next Sunday. Went to a little church called Jones Gap. Preached there the next Sunday. It was on that happened to be on July the 4th of 2000 and in 2004.
Really?
And so preached my first message on the 4th. There was fireworks, man. It was great. I like to tell people that. I'll be honest, after Sunday morning's message, I felt like I had totally missed it.
Yeah.
It felt like a total flop. But then God, just in his way of being so good to us and gracious, that night I went and preached at Jones Gap, and it was just seemed like just a touch of God on it. Yeah. And after Sunday night, I was like, yeah, I know I'm doing what God's called me to do now.
Right.
He just confirmed it.
Yeah. That's so when did you, how much longer till Justin started preaching?
Yeah, so
Brandon started preaching.
Yeah, so then I went to Bible college with where David Bain was going, Georgia Baptist College. And, my thing was I went to a youth camp that was run by that church, and then I'd seen some of the product of people associated with that church, and I'm like, if I can learn this much in a week at youth camp, and if God can do this much in my life through these men who have been associated with these ministries, what can I get in 4 years of Bible college there? So I transferred, went to Bible college. Then that first semester, while I'm in college, God's just working my brother over.
Yeah.
I mean, he gets a hold of Tom Gillum's sermons on the love of God, and he's coming to see the doctrines of grace, and he ain't got nobody to bounce it off of.
Right.
Because let's just be honest, in the area we grew up in, now they believe the doctrines of grace when it comes to the practical side of it,
right,
and the scriptural side, but when you start labeling things with terms,
yeah, they start getting spooky.
Yeah. And so he didn't have nobody he could bounce it off of.
Right.
So he's calling me and bouncing it off me, and of course I'm learning these things in Bible college, and I tell people, because they ask, well, was it hard for you to learn it? No. I'd heard bits and pieces from preachers enough that I knew God was a big God and he was sovereign.
Yeah, he's in control.
And so when I was presented with this, in fact, even I remember David, he was kind of nervous because I think in the first class when we actually went through it and they dealt with Tulip, he came to me afterwards and he's like, man, are you all right? And I was kind of confused, like, yeah, well, what's up? He's like, well, these doctrines, man, they're not spooking you. I'm like, no, makes sense.
Yeah.
He's God. You know, didn't have a problem. So we're bouncing it off. Justin's getting, well, then God's dealing with his heart about preaching. And he surrendered to preach that fall of my first year. So probably like 4 or 5 months after I'd surrendered, he surrendered to preach. And then he came down after that first semester and started going to Bible college with us. So not till later that Brandon Harrell, he gets saved. And so he's been out of church. He's kind of left everything he grew up hearing. And during the time we're in Bible college getting training, God's dealing with his heart, convicting him. He gets saved, and pretty much as soon as he's saved, like God's dealing with his heart about preaching. I mean, it's just almost the whole package at one time. And so then he gets into a church where he gets baptized, and he's being a faithful member. Brother Jim Whitted was his pastor at the time. He's going home to be with the Lord, but an old mountain preacher had a touch of God on him. And he's having an influence on Brandon. Brandon starts preaching, and God's just opening doors. And then Brandon ends up going over to East Flat Rock. I believe then it was Free Will Baptist Church.
It was, yeah. It was Free Will Baptist when he went.
Yep. And he went there about the same time that I came out here.
Yeah.
And in fact, their church was one of the first churches that took me on for support when I was out here after he went there.
Right. Wow.
And then in turn, whenever he stepped out, our church was one of the first churches that took him on. Yeah. Just the way God worked that out. But yeah, so so that's kind of the history. And then we graduate and we find out, hey, Brandon's preaching, he's serving God. We kind of paths that diverged have now come back together. We just pick right back up where we left off, still good friends preaching together. And then in 2009, God opens the door for me to come out here for 3 months, and I end up being here for 16 years.
Yep. I was like, I didn't really grow up. I didn't start preaching until I was 31.
Mm-hmm.
So I hear about you, your brother, David Bain, Brandon Harrell, all of you living in this little rural area.
Yep.
All of you roughly same, age bracket, within a few years of each other. All of you called to preach roughly the same time. All of you still in the ministry 20 plus years later.
Yep.
And I'm like, something happened.
Yeah.
there. Somebody was praying for preachers there.
That's it, yeah.
Because you just don't find that. I mean, here we're in an area here in the Fort Smith area. I mean, with our offices in Van Buren, but I don't hear 4 preachers all coming into the ministry within a year that are still going to be in the ministry 20 plus years later.
Yep.
I mean, it just.
Well, and here's an amazing thing, and just to that point, not to pile it on, but a guy named Jonathan Shook surrendered. He was the first guy to surrender to preaching at tent meeting. He's still preaching today.
Really?
Philip Luther, who actually we went to high school with. I played football with Philip. He was a year between me and my brother, and we played defense together for years. And he surrendered to preaching that meeting.
Really?
In that tent meeting, and he's still pastoring today. In fact, Brandon Harrell was at his church Sunday night giving a report of the ministry. They support the Revival Literature, Global Baptist Ministries. Right. So there's been there's even more fruit of that tent meeting. And I think, brother, what it was, it may not be the kind of revival like they saw on the Isle of Lewis or in the Great Welsh Revival, but there was a measure of revival, brother. God moved, and there were people praying. And I'll just give this one shout out to a dear saint that's already in. She already has her reward, but Sister Sheila Doom was one of those. Yeah, she prayed that God would raise up soldiers. And God answered her prayers. And she
invested in probably in all you guys.
Oh man, every one of us. She's give us books.
Yeah,
books and books. Yep.
I've met her. I met her once or twice. I think twice, but you could just tell she was a lady that was lady of prayer, knew the Lord, walked with the Lord. Yeah. And you could tell it when you talked to her. She
was her daddy's daughter for sure.
Yeah, and. Her dad is
the late James A. Stewart.
James A. Stewart. Yeah. We have a bunch of his books here in the bookstore. Yeah. And James Stewart, Missionary, is a biography of his that if anybody asks me to recommend a biography, I recommend James Stewart, Missionary, and I give away quite a few of those. But no, I just having the people around you, getting into Georgia Baptist College, I didn't have any of that.
Right.
And when I began preaching, I didn't really know anybody. Mm-hmm. I remember pastoring my first church. I started preaching in March of 2006. By November of 2006, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, I was the pastor of Vine Prairie Baptist Church in Mulberry, Arkansas. And they had a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf in a closet. It was a broom closet. I said, I need an office. They cleaned out this kind of little walk-in closet and made it my office, and then somebody, I don't know how they squeezed it in there, but they had a bookshelf that took up one whole wall. It went almost all the way to the ceiling because they said, every preacher's got a bunch of books. So I went home, and I'm not a reader. Yeah. Well, here's the funny thing. I got a freak bookstore. I don't even read books. I've given away thousands of books over the years and never really read a lot of them. But I went home and sorted through all the books we had in our home. And I went back down there, and this one guy, Jesse and I talked about him, Danny Burton.
Oh, yeah.
I told him I was going to start preaching, and he said, you're going to need some material. I said, material? He ordered me a John MacArthur study Bible and Matthew, there was 2 commentaries on Matthew. So I had all 28 chapters of Matthew, Ephesians, it was Matthew 1-8, Ephesians, and both commentaries on Romans. So I had 4 commentaries, and I had a John MacArthur study Bible, real fancy leather. I mean, it was nice, with my name stamped in it. And then I had a W.A. Criswell biography. Yeah. He's the pastor of First Baptist, had his biography. And then somebody gave me a copy of, some commentary. It's pretty well known, but the guy's kind of flaky. I can't think of it. Anyways, I had a couple of Old Testament books from him. And so my entire theological library took up about a foot of one shelf, and that was it. And I just didn't know anything, And I remember the second week I was there as pastor, I got a newspaper sent to me, And I opened it up, and I was like, what is this? It's the Sword of the Lord.
Oh, yeah.
From Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And I started reading. I said, man, these guys are old-timey. You know, this is my crowd. That cut from a different cloth. I started reading the Sword of the Lord, and I thought, boy, I got something. And lo and behold, they sent it every other week, whether I wanted it or not.
Yeah.
And I was reading these sermons in there, and then I would go to the associational meetings of the Southern Baptist Association. Yeah. And I just quickly was like, man, I'm not Southern Baptist. These guys are not me. I'm different. Yeah. The one thing I knew was Danny Burton was a verse-by-verse guy. We just went verse by verse, and I knew that's what I was going to do. Of course, I only had like 4 or 5 commentaries. I didn't have the internet. You know, I didn't have nothing. And I'd just read and pray and read and pray. And I'm telling you all this because I didn't have any of that available to me that you have. The men, the camaraderie, the college, preachers around you. I'm in my first church preaching and don't know a thing in the world about what I'm doing, right and wrong. And I know for a fact I don't like the Southern Baptist Convention. As soon as I look behind the curtains and see how they were making the sausage, I'm like, nah, I don't want no more of that sausage. Yeah. I saw what they put in it, you know? So I was at that church a year. I came to Lee Creek. As soon as I got there, the people in the church were like, we're sick of the Southern Baptist Convention. How do you feel about them? I was like, I don't like them either. They said, let's get out of it. I said, okay. I mean, I'd literally been there 6 months, and they were ready to get out. It was their idea. So we unanimously voted to get out. Brandon, I wanted so bad to find what I called my camp. Yeah, sure. I mean, I wanted a group of people, and I said, these are my guys. So there was a conference up at Stillwell, Oklahoma. Oh, yeah. First Baptist Stillwell. Roger Haney put it on. I heard about that. I went up there, and I really wanted to be in that circle. You know, I thought, but it wasn't me. I would have had to alter me to be in that group, you know. And so then I got in my car with my wife, and we went out to Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Went to the promised land, we went and we was going to meet the Godfather, you know. And I got out there, and, I mean, they rolled out the red carpet. We're in a church of 1,500 people. Yep. Somebody found out I was a pastor, and they recognized me. Yeah. We got Brother Harold Smith and his wife, Missy, from Van Buren, Arkansas, at Lee Creek Baptist Church. Stand up, brother. Y'all give this man a hand. He's a man of God out here preaching the word with us today. They all applauded for my wife and I, and then I shook more hands than Abraham Lincoln on the election trail. I'm not kidding you. And people were just like, oh, we love preachers. And I thought, baby, we found it. We sat down. I was like, these people are nice. And they just made God so small all through the sermon. Yeah. He couldn't do nothing. He was hogtied and hamstrung. And I looked over at my wife, and she looked at me, and she's like, this ain't it. No. So we went to Nashville and visited another IFB, King James, soul-winning, suit and tie bus route. And I'm like, baby, this ain't it. Yeah. This is, and so I came home discouraged. Sure. Then I went to Mobile, Alabama, and listened to Stephen Lawson and R.C. Sproles. Is that the True Church Conference? No, it was the Expositors Conference that Steve Lawson used to put on. Yep. And I sat down there amongst a bunch of Presbyterians, deader than a sack of hammers. Yep. And I thought, I mean, the singing was, like I said, it was professional. Yeah. There was a lady up there playing a grand piano, or a guy up there playing a grand piano. I mean, he's as good a piano player as you'll ever hear. Mm-hmm. But it was just stuffy and dead and orthodox, and I was like, just everything was so ritualistic. I couldn't get on with that. So I always just felt like a man without a country. Yeah. No mentors. And I mean, that's the way the Lord wanted me to grow up. Sure. In the ministry. And, but instead, what ended up happening, instead of growing up under men and being influenced by men, and even though you were talking about getting bits and pieces of it, you still had some close ties to some solid men that had seen God move. Absolutely. I had nothing. Everybody I knew in the past was Southern Baptist. Mm-hmm. Nobody I really knew in my current ministry really had anything. And so that's kind of how I ended up doing a lot of what I do today, just trying to get preachers together. Yeah. I mean, we're going to have lunch here in a little while. There'll probably be 10 or 12 guys here today. Yeah. There's, a dozen of them that won't make it. If everybody shows up, we'll have 25 people here.
Yeah.
But because I was on an island for so long, I just wanted to get other guys off the island.
Well, and clearly God was uniquely grooming you for
Yeah.
the ministry that he has for you.
But I really wish I had known what you knew about revivals and tent meetings. See, I just dismissed all that. I'm like, that's the bus route guys. They're the ones doing all that. That's just fake. That's man-made.
Yeah.
I'd never been around it where it was genuine and real.
And that's the thing, because of the error, the bad apple of a few, the whole group gets thrown out with the bath water.
Yeah.
And yeah, sometimes we can be real dismissive. Well, for instance, all I had ever known about Southern Baptists were they were a bunch of liberals.
Yeah.
And then I move out here and I get to meeting other guys, and even in Southern Alabama, there are some Southern Baptist churches out there, bro, that are stronger and straighter than some independent Baptist churches.
Oh, yeah.
Which was more influence that I had. And it does teach you that you can't just take something at face value. There's not a blanket statement
Right.
or a blanket view of any group. You've got to take it on a case-by-case scenario and realize that there's some really good folk in these different circles. And that's one thing it's taught me. It's funny, though, God had you, preaching 6 months after you'd surrendered to preach, pastoring a church?
Yeah, I was pastoring the church 6 months later.
See, I thought I should have been pastoring and preaching revivals every week 6 months after I surrendered to preach, but God didn't let me start till about 5 years. But I look back on it, and it was probably good, brother.
Yeah.
I'd have tore up more than I'd have ever built
Well,
up.
what was funny was I surrendered to preach. I didn't want to tell anybody because I just want to keep it a secret.
Sure.
I don't know if I've ever told publicly how I entered the ministry, but I was in Sunday school class. I've told people about the conviction about how I ended up, but I didn't want nobody to know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was talking to this guy. He and I were co-teaching a Sunday school class. And I said, man, I really feel like God's calling me to preach. I said, but don't you dare tell anybody. I'm not sure yet. He just marched straight down to the interim pastors that we had, told him. I ended up there. Long story short, he says, tell the pastor and just follow. The new pastor will be here in a week. Give him a couple days to get settled in. Go by his office, introduce yourself, tell him you're called to preach. So I did. And he said, that's great, brother. You'll preach Sunday night. This was like Thursday.
Yeah.
I was like, no, I was kind of just like maybe wading in it, not jumping in it,
Yeah.
And I preached that Sunday night, and nobody in the church even knew who I was. We went to a large church, ran about 400, and had 2 services with about, 200 people in each service. So I just knew the people that were about my age. I remember announcing Sunday morning that tonight we're excited. One of our very own is going to preach his first sermon. Harold Smith will be preaching tonight. He says he's called to preach. The guy in front of me leans over to his wife and goes, who's Harold Smith? I was sitting right in front of him. I was like, dude, I shake your hand every day. You don't even know my name. And but I went to that big church to hide because I was under conviction for years that I ought to be doing this. And anyways, I preached that night, and the church bought me a suit and tie and gave me a license to preach. I had a little plaque. He said, go to the association meeting and tell them your name and that you're licensed to preach out of Concord Baptist Church. So I did. And I sat down, and this guy poked me in the back, and I turned around and he handed me his business card, and I flipped it over, and it said, can you preach Sunday morning and Sunday night? And it was the next Sunday. And I said, yeah. And that was Joe Walden. He'll be here today.
Oh, yeah.
And Brother Joe was like, can you do this? I said, yeah. Brother, I preached every Sunday but Mother's Day.
Yeah.
Mother's Day was the only Sunday I didn't preach from the day I surrendered until I was pastoring Vine Prairie Baptist Church. And I was thrust into it, you know. I mean, it was just, there was all these opportunities to preach all the time. And I had churches coming up to me. I'd been preaching a month. I preached over here at Roland Hills Baptist. They were without a pastor. And I went over there and preached Sunday morning. I came back Sunday night. There were 7 of them.
Yeah.
And the guy came up and he said, well, we kind of hung around after you left and we voted unanimously to call you as our next pastor. I had 1 month experience.
Yeah.
I said, well, brother, I'd have to pray about that. I said, I'm not really sure that's what I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know, you know. And I went home and I prayed and prayed and prayed. And I was like, no, I said, I'm sorry. I just don't feel like this is where I'm supposed to be. I don't feel like I'm ready to be your pastor. Y'all need somebody that knows what they're doing. They need a Harold Smith at 50, not a Harold Smith at 31.
Yeah.
And I turned them down, and they just begged me and begged me and begged me. I just quit preaching over there.
Yeah.
But, yeah, the path that every preacher's on a different path.
Sure.
He's got different influences. And I was really, you asked me to pick up Larry Winkler and bring him down to the church before Jubilee.
Right.
And I wanted to really pick Larry Winkler's brain. You know, I was like, I'm going to get this guy in the car for an hour and 45 minutes. We're going to talk. And that joker wouldn't say nothing. I mean, he'd talk a lot, but he wouldn't give me any of the information I needed.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying.
I said, Brother Larry, are you preaching a lot? Oh yeah, Brother Harold. I've been real busy. And this is what I said. I said, well, could you tell me, like, when the last time, and it might be a few years, when's the last time you've been in a sure enough revival meeting where God changed lives? I don't mean just a good meeting, but I mean the Lord just did something and worked in lives. And I looked over at him, and he was like, yeah. Well, I have to think on that, Brother Harold. Have you been preaching a lot? And I was like, oh, yeah, I've been traveling all around. I preached this morning in Plummerville, and I'm driving you to Smithville, and we were kind of laughing and joking about that. He never told me when the last true revival he was in. So I would ask him, well, how were the revivals, you know, when you were younger? He'd tell me that. Yeah. We used to start on a Sunday and end the following Sunday, and if the Lord was working, we'd go another week. Yeah. And we'd do that until we were done. And I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. And I said, what do you think happened? Mm-hmm. And he goes, oh, I don't know. I'm like, you've got an opinion, Larry, just, you know, but he just didn't feel at liberty to tell me.
Real humble fella. He don't like to talk much, does he?
No, he's friendly.
Yeah.
You know,
is friendly.
He's not.
He's just not going to divulge a lot of info.
Yeah, it's not like he's sitting over there with his arms crossed. I'm not talking.
No.
He just, and I just told him point blank. I looked at him. We was coming through about, I don't know, what is that? Saddle Gap or something.
3 Sticks up on the mountain.
Yeah, we'd gone past 3 Sticks, and I
got you. Yeah.
That little gap through there. I think it's called Saddle Gap, and I was like, crap, we're getting close to church, man. I ain't going to be able to get much out of him. And I just said, Larry, I'm just going to level with you. I didn't have a mentor. Nobody's ever taught me these things. I said, I'm trying to get some information so I can kind of know how to conduct myself in revival meetings. He said, well, Brother Harold, I just don't know if I'd have anything to tell you. I'm like, dude, you've been preaching for 65 years. Yeah. You've got more information than anybody I'll ever encounter. He just wasn't going to turn it loose.
Yeah. You know, another funny story about that, Vincent took him back to the airport at the end of the meeting. And so Vincent.
Did he throw his mantle on Vincent?
No, Vincent, you know, he's a new pastor. He's taking his first church. And so he asks Brother Larry, he says, well, you know, I'm at a new church. I'm first-time pastor. Any advice you'd have for a young pastor? He said, Larry kind of cleared his throat, thought for a second, and he said, you'll figure it out.
That's his approach.
And I think maybe that's there's a lot of wisdom in that, because he's saying basically, let God be your teacher.
Me. Yeah,
that's right. Let God be your teacher. Don't follow man.
Well, I dropped him off, and then I had 2 hours back to my house, you know, and I was driving back, and I'd been, of course, Brandon Harrell and I had rode an hour and a half to Plummerville and back, so I had 3 hours in the car with Brandon Harrell, and he preached. Wade Lentz preached. We ate lunch. I preached, and we came back. I'd had a long day. I'd heard a lot of sermons. Mm-hmm. I'd had a lot of conversations, and I was just driving back from dropping Larry off, and I was like, dude, I really thought I was going to get some insight and information, and I got nothing. And but a lot of those guys are that way. It's not that they don't care about you. Mm-mm. Tom Gillam's the same way.
Yeah.
You get around Tom Gillam, he'll just want to talk about you.
Yeah.
What have you been doing, Brother Harold?
Yeah.
Have you seen Richard lately? When's the last time you talked to so-and-so? And I'm like, all right, Tom, time out. My turn to ask questions.
Yeah.
Because that's what Tom will do. He'll just question you to death.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story as a joke we pulled on Tom. Did I ever tell you about the time Richard Kleinard was coming to town and Tom didn't know it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I need to hear it again if I have. Wade
Lentz had scheduled Tom Gillum to come in and preach. I think Tom was preaching at night, and maybe I was preaching in the morning. I don't remember. I know I preached in the meeting. Maybe I preached one morning or 2 or 3 mornings. I don't know. It was like it was a lunchtime. No, because we were eating lunch. I don't remember. Somehow I'm down there, and Richard Kleinard called me, and he said, "Hey, is Tom Gillum preaching down there?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "I think I want to come down there and hear him." So Richard lives in South Tennessee, just north of Muscle Shoals, Alabama. He said, "I think it's like a 5-hour drive." He said, "I'm just going to drive it, and we'll stay the night." I said, "Well, we've been eating lunch together every day." I said, "So if you get out here in lunchtime, we'll all eat lunch together." All right. Well, he called me. He said, "Where are we eating at?" And I told him. He said, "I tell you what." He said, I'm going to let y'all get in there. He said, "I'm already here." He said, "I'm going to let y'all get in there and sit down. And then me and this guy's going to come in and get a table right next to you." He said, "Because I'll just about bet you," because I hadn't, that's what it was. Tom had come in. I was preaching later in the week. This was like our first. Tom had preached the night before, and I was coming in to preach before him. So I had just got around Tom. I hadn't seen him in a year or so. He said, "I'll guarantee you," he asked me if you've talked to him lately, because he always asked me if I've talked to you. I said, "Okay." So I told the waitress, they were getting our table together, the hostess or whatever. I said, "Hey, look, we got a couple guys coming in. They need to be seated across from this gray-haired man right here where he can see them." And she was like, "Okay." I said, "They're going to sit with us eventually, but we don't want the empty chair." I mean, this is a setup deal. So anyways, we go in there and sit down, and Tom Gillum's getting all of his stuff together. He goes, "Brother Harold, have you talked to Richard Kleinard lately?" And he looked up at me and he goes, "There's Richard Kleinard right there. There's Richard Kleinard right there." He was hollering across the room. Richard was just walking in nonchalant, not looking at him. He goes, "Richard." And he looked around the table, and me and Wade were in on it. Nobody else was. And Richard was grinning, and he goes, "Y'all knew he was coming, didn't you?" And I said, "Yeah." But he couldn't have timed it any better. "Have you talked to Richard Kleinard lately?" And he looked at me, and Richard was walking right behind me. And I mean, he goes, "Are we just driving down the interstate looking for a place to eat?" Tom Gillum was looking around, and he got red. He could tell. He goes, y'all tricked me. And but it was funny.
Yes, sir.
You getting cramped up? You ready to get up and stretch your legs?
Oh, it's no problem.
All right. Well,
you probably got a time limit on these things, don't you?
No, we don't. We don't. People turn them off after 2 or 3 minutes. They hear the intro.
They just like the intro.
They listen to the intro, and they're like, "No, I don't want no more of that," or "That's the best part of the whole show is the intro." The funny thing is about this podcast, and I'll tell you about it, but I've had people call me from all over the country, email me. They used to start out emailing me because I put my email address on there sometimes. Yeah. They'll email me, and I'll say, "Look, man, I'm not a typer. If you want to talk to me, call me."
Right.
But I'll have people from, I don't know, north, south, east, west, just call me out of the blue and be like, "Hey, man, I've listened to all your episodes." And I'm like, "Really?" And they're like, "Oh, yeah, it's taken me 6 months, but I've backed up and caught them all." And matter of fact, I preached for Robbie McClelland and Arlington Baptist in Arlington, South Dakota, Sunday before last. And he and Tom Kennedy are brothers.
That's right. Yeah.
And
telling me about that.
I never met Robbie. Don't know him. Didn't grow up with him. Tom Kennedy lives in South Georgia. I've preached for him some, but we mainly talk on the phone. But his brother was listening to some podcasts, and he said, "Hey, man, I want you to come and share some of that with our church." And so, the reason that I do the podcast is because I never know who's listening.
Yeah, sure.
And some guys' podcast is really, and I did this a lot. I had issues that I didn't like. And I was like, man, I'm going to talk about it. Nobody else is talking about it. I talk about stuff nobody else wants to talk about. But you don't want to be the guy that just gets on here and rants. You know, you don't want to be known as the guy that's anti-everything.
Right.
And a lot of what I do in the ministry is just talk to preachers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of pastors call me and they want advice or they just want to talk to somebody. And I said, you know, what we really ought to do is get preachers on here and just sit down and talk with no agenda, just unscripted.
Yep.
You know, I didn't say, hey, man, we want to talk about X, Y, and Z.
Right.
Just get on here and talk about whatever. But what I've discovered is guys say, you know, there's no other preachers in my area.
Yeah.
When I listen to you and Ronnie Qualls or you and Jesse Anderson, it's like I'm at a pastor's fellowship and I'm laughing at the stories you're telling. I'm thinking about how that's happened to me. I mean, all these guys. I just talked to a pastor in East Texas about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And he said, man, I don't have a lot of fellowship. He said, I agree with about 98% of what you say. And he said, the other 2% I can stomach.
Get over.
Yeah. And he said, but I just don't have any, I don't have the kind of fellowship you have. And I said, well, man, it's just he said, but the conversations, he said, a lot of what you talk about, I really think needs to be said. He said, but it's the conversations. He said, I hear you guys talk and we do 2-hour podcasts sometimes.
I got you.
And he said, it may take me a couple of days to get through it. He said, but I enjoy it. And then a pastor from Ohio would email me the next week and be like, hey, I'm just in an area where I don't have a lot of fellowship. And a lot of them have questions about, pastoring, how do you handle a deacon? But you just look at that scope. Those are guys I wouldn't know any other way, you know?
That's right.
And I think it's just good. And my advice, I was talking to a pastor in South Georgia the other day, and I'd introduced him to Tom Kennedy. His name's David Marshall. If David Marshall lived closer to you and I, it would be bad. I mean, it would be real bad. If we lived in South Georgia where you got like a 9 deer limit, it'd be real bad. They hunt deer with dogs down there.
I don't know. It might be good, Harold. Wouldn't have to worry about going over my limit.
Well, that's just it. In Arkansas, back in the old days, you only had 3 tags. We had guys trying to write in invisible ink and everything else, putting wax on the paper and putting ink over the wax so that they could get their deer home and then melt the wax off and wipe the ink off, and then they'd still have a tag left. And because you couldn't transport a deer without a tag on it. Well, down there, they don't even care. They just like hold your hand up and, swear that you've only killed 9. But they hunt them like rabbits. And they get out shotguns and buckshot and turn dogs loose in the thicket and just shoot them when they run out. Yep. And, if I was down there in a church like that and had guys that ran dogs and hunted deer like rabbits, it would not be a good thing for me. But anyways, I say all that to say, David was like, we don't have the kind of fellowship y'all have. Yeah. And I said, well, you need to start. You and Tom need to get together and meet once a month. I don't care if you drink coffee or meet down at Gold House and eat buffet or whatever. Yep. Meet once a month, and then any preacher that's like-minded, invite them, and then they may know somebody and invite them. Because I introduced these 2 guys. They didn't know each other. I'm sure they would have eventually got acquainted, but you just got to build that.
Yeah. Yeah, it just comes over time, building relationships. And, I don't really like the word networking, but you're networking with guys that you have confidence in and that you have an interest in, and you share things in common, and you bring them together. And, man, that's a lot of what ministry is about, especially the day we live in. And it is. I know we're fixing to head out in California. The fellowship's going to be few and far between compared to what we've enjoyed here. And but I'm praying God will let us make some of those acquaintances, and maybe in time some more connections can be had. And,
well, if we get any liberal pastors, we'll send them out there to plant a church around you.
I appreciate that. I don't know. You know, God may just be fixing to do something. Maybe he's going to send all the conservative guys to California and send all the liberal ones out here.
He did say he would send his sheep out among wolves. I started to say he don't throw his prophets in the fire without standing in there with them.
Oh.
Man, I'm sitting on the edge of this chair. You know what? I'm just one $200 a month church supporter away from buying some comfortable chairs to do these podcasts in. The guys were complaining that it was cold in here 2 months ago for the pastor's lunch. We just had them little space heaters back there running. And I said, look, man, I'm not paying a gas bill for 12 months that only runs the heater for 3 hours in the winter, you know, while y'all come in and eat lunch.
Yeah,
and,
3 hours once a month.
Yeah. And anyways, one of them was complaining about, I said, you know, if you church would adopt a missionary for just $100 a month, I said, I'd pay that gas bill all year. You could have a nice warm lunch. But
Probably had 5 phone calls the next week, didn't you? Brother Harold, we took you on. Hey
man, I've never asked anybody for a penny, and I've never lacked anything.
Yes, sir.
I mean, I'm telling you, I got this thing where I trade $100 bills with God. I get $100 bills, and if I get 2, I give 1 away, right? And I had 3 $100 bills a couple weeks ago. This is back before Jubilee. I had 3 $100 bills given to me. And I gave all 3 of them away. And who gave me those? This lady came up to me out of the blue in a church I had never been in, never spoke in, never preached at. She said, you the guys got the bookstore, they give away books? And I said, yeah. She said, I've got something for you. And I was like, oh, man, she's probably got a stack of some kind of Amish romance novels she wants me to take to the bookstore. You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And she turned around and handed me a $100 bill.
How about that?
And I said, well, thank you. I said, I appreciate that. And I said, you want me to get books with that? And she said, no, you just take it and do whatever you need to do with it. I said, okay. So then I stopped and talked to another couple. I hadn't seen them in a while. We were driving by their house. I called them. I said, hey, we're coming by your house. Y'all home? Pulled in there, and they said, we've been looking for you. She went over there to the counter, and she had a $100 bill rolled up. She handed it to me. And I've been doing that, giving away $100 bills, getting back $100 bills. Sometimes guys walk up and hand you $400 or $500 bills. Yeah. You hand all that out, it all comes right back. And I just keep going back to George Mueller saying, if you share your purse with God, he'll share his purse with you. Yeah.
Amen.
And if you're not in it for the money, then you don't need a lot of money to make it work.
Yep.
And that's one of the joys about the bookstore. People come in here and they look around and they go, who pays for all this? I said, man, the Lord does.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring that up. You know, that was my case in coming to Oklahoma. I came out here with a promise of $100 a month support for 3 months. And whenever the Lord laid it on my heart to stay, and I talked to the preacher I was working with, Brother Raymond at the time, and he said, yeah, we've been praying about that. God just started bringing the support in. I didn't even have to go out and do deputation like a lot of missionaries did. I didn't do that.
Yeah.
And, God has always supplied our need. And it's funny because as he started sending it in, I was well aware of the need to also send it out. And there were times, especially at Indian Mission early on in the early days, we were a real small church, I paid the church to preach. I wasn't getting paid to preach there. I was paying them to preach there.
Yeah.
But, God blessed that. And I learned in that you cannot outgive God. And the way you said, that's another good way of saying it, but God will give more through you than he will to you. And I got to see God do that. And as I would give and I would just try to invest, God would always meet the need. And man, I've never gone without food. I've got a wife and 4 kids, and you know how expensive that can be in this day and age, but God he's always supplied.
You've not just sat around on your laurels and asked God to drop it in your lap.
That's true.
You've also realized and been a responsible husband and father and said, look, I need to work and make this work.
Sure. Yeah.
And you've not been lazy in a secular job.
Yep. And God provides in that, right?
Yeah. Man, Jubilee wouldn't have been Jubilee if you weren't making homemade bologna.
Yeah.
Salt pork.
Yeah.
Summer sausage. I remember me, you, and Sanchez going back when you still had White's Deer Processing at your house.
Yep.
And you had like 4 sticks of bologna hanging in the cooler in there that you'd put together.
Yep.
And we were slicing that on the meat slicer, and I was like, boy, that's Backwoods Baptist when they got homemade bologna at the pastor's.
We'd make all
table.
the bacon and sausage.
Yeah.
And you'd be in there, and Michael pulling pork with me on barbecue day.
Yeah, shredding pork. Mm-hmm. Ron Lovins would walk in and go, "Hallelujah, what a savor!"
Yeah, that's right.
What he'd always say when he'd walk in.
Yeah, and then he'd want a sample.
Yeah, exactly. Let me have a little bit of that. But no, I mean, I think a pastor ought to have, and this is something I probably ought to talk about since we're so close, not get away from it. I think a pastor ought to have some skills.
Sure. Absolutely.
Maybe it's tech skills and he can do computer repair, or maybe he can do stuff online. I don't know. Or maybe, he knows how to fix an AC unit. Mm-hmm. What I see a lot in young pastors is they don't know nothing but preaching. Yep. And if they can't make a living preaching, they're just sitting there going in the hole, running their credit cards up. Yep. I'm just blown away at the credit card debt that I've discovered young pastors carry.
Yeah. Well, and it's sad because some men won't even go to a church or won't stay at a church that can't take them on or take care of them full time. And I guess in some cases, I know I'm not going to be a judge of another man's servant. That's God's man. But how often could that maybe be avoided if a man was willing to pick up a hammer? When I went to Oklahoma, I didn't have any real work experience outside of tree work. Mm-hmm. And that's hard work. I'd worked with the Morgan brothers doing tree work. I'd worked in factory and Bible college, but it was just, brainless work. Right? You just do the same thing. But, when I got to Oklahoma, my wife's family had done processing for years. We had an empty building, and I was like, hey, this would be a way to make a little money on the side. Yeah. And then, over the years, God blessed it, and it grew, and we had a great reputation. I read a thing the other day that said, you do good work, and the people you do the work for will be your advertisement. You don't have to pay for advertisement. That's right. But, we honed those skills. I watched a lot of YouTube videos, and God used that. But I'm glad I have that now.
But you put in the time to get it. It's not like you walked into a church and said, oh, by the way, I'm a mechanic.
That's right. No.
But you're not afraid to get your hands dirty. I remember when you bought my old silver Toyota pickup.
Yeah. Yep. And
I think the clutch or something was going out in it or something. I don't remember what it was now. And you called me and he's like, hey, man, what about this clutch? And I'm like, dude, I ain't a mechanic. I have no idea. Yeah. I have no idea. But you had to do it, you know. So you digging in there trying to fix it.
Yep.
I see a lot of younger guys coming up. They don't know how to fix anything.
Oh, you're right.
Their entire toolbox would fit, in a they just don't have any equipment. They don't have, and they don't have the desire to dig in and get it.
I know what you're saying. Like with that Tacoma, I had to change out the water pump, and when you do that, you might as well change out the thermostat. Well, on that thing, you have to take the radiator completely out of that old pickup. But I learned to do it. Thank God for YouTube and internet. Yeah. And our house we live in, and I'm it's not bragging. It's just what it is. We remodeled that thing a couple of times. I did most of the work myself.
I remember that.
And we learned again how to cut meat, and we built the business. But a lot of that just has to do with not being lazy and realizing, I can't afford to pay somebody else to do all these things. Right. If it's going to get done, I'm going to have to do it. And just having a work ethic, and I think that may be a sign of the times. When I came to Indian Mission, which I probably said this a little bit in my inexperience and youthful zeal, I got up in the pulpit the very first service that I preached, and I said, look, I'm not here to try to straighten anybody out. Y'all have been serving God long before I got here. I think that was wise. But then I followed it up with a little bit, I wanted to show just how committed I was. Hey, if that means I got to be digging a ditch next week, I'll be right there digging a ditch with you. I'm here to serve you. Well, the next week, I was in the backyard of the church digging a ditch. Septic line had got stopped up.
Yeah.
And it had to be done.
Yep.
And it's funny because it's almost like God's like, okay, we're going to see how serious you are.
And I tell young preachers, if you ain't ready to clean their toilets, you ain't ready to be their pastor.
Yeah, that's good.
And I don't know. I'm just running into, and I think it's a generational thing. I'm running into a generation of preachers that just hire it all done.
Yeah.
And I don't think, unless you're in some large church that's just got a bunch of wealthy people,
Right.
you got to learn to run the sound. You've got to learn to unstop the sewer line. You've got to learn these things, and you got to be hands-on.
Yeah.
Or you've got to surround yourself with men that are hands-on. And
well, it ain't necessary, but it does go a long way in how your people will appreciate and even respect you too when they see you doing the menial tasks,
especially in rural areas.
Yeah.
You know, if you're in some large community, you know, if you're in outskirts of Dallas or Oklahoma City, there's enough people around there. You can probably gather up 40 or 50 or 60 and have a church. But if you're going to pastor in a town of, say, 5,000 people, there's probably 3 other Baptist churches if you're in the South.
Yeah.
And you need to learn these things.
That's right.
And Don Sable, we both know Don Sable. Don Sable said one time, he said, all you young pastors need to get you a side job. And he said it would do you good. And I think it would do you good, not just to be independent of needing church support, but it would do you good to be reminded what it takes to gather the support people are giving to the church.
That's right.
A blue-collar reminder is
it
what I
helps
would
you
call
relate
it.
to the people you're preaching to, doesn't it?
Yeah. I don't see a lot of that.
No.
You know, I see a lot of guys that they don't realize what a day's work is.
Yeah.
And
well, I'll tell you one thing. That's one thing that helped me on Wednesday night services. You work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You feel just like the folk you're preaching to. You're going to get to the point, and you're not going to drag it out and make it some 45-minute to an hour-long, you know, theological dissertation that those folks sitting there are saying, man, how's this going to help me tomorrow when I got to go back to work?
He said the same thing 8 times. Is he trying to just, you know, hit a time limit?
I know, yeah.
But, yeah, you're right. You feel the way they feel.
Yep.
There's a relational
you relate to them,
aspect of working. And like I said, Jubilee wouldn't be Jubilee if we didn't have, you know, hand-cured bacon and homemade bologna. And, I mean, you smoked a whole hog that one year with deboned it, stuffed it full of summer sausage, sewed it back up, smoked it all.
Yep.
I mean, that's backwoods Baptist stuff right there.
Yeah. Well, what some of that stuff does is, whether it's the preparation of it leading up to, or the hands-on preparing it right then when you're fixing to eat it, it promotes fellowship.
Yeah.
Among the brethren, among your church men, they get involved. And now, instead of, you know, it's easy to just, it would be much easier to just cater it in.
Yeah.
And it'd be a lot more expensive too. But when you do it yourself, you are giving your people opportunity to fellowship. And so, like on breakfasts now, you got a Danny Staggs there, and you got Jared Parrish there, and you got the different men that are showing up. Larry
Scott scrambles eggs.
Yep.
Jared
Larry's
makes gravy.
making the coffee.
Yeah, Larry's making coffee, and Danny's out back cooking bacon, or Vincent's out there with him. Also, I really think it's a way of showing your church and serving your church.
Yeah, that's right.
It's one thing to say, hey, the church bought pizza, let's eat.
Yep.
It's another to say, hey, I cooked pot roast.
Yeah, that's true.
You know, I mean, I cook tacos. That's what we're going to have here in a little bit. That's my way of showing all these pastors that come today, man, I care about you.
Yep.
You know, I got up this morning at 6 o'clock, opened up 10 pounds worth of beef, and browned it, chopped up onions, and made it, you know.
Yep.
And I purchased it all. I don't say that to brag. It's my way of telling these guys, hey, look, man, I think this is important. If you've got invested time and you've got invested money, people respect it.
That's right.
If I just throw out some cheap pizzas, everybody comes and eats, there's no real investment here.
Yep.
And if we just met for coffee, there's no real investment here.
Yeah.
But I just think that's another aspect. And you know, you leave an Indian mission. It's like when I leave a church, you know, if I've gone into a church as interim, I've cooked for them a bunch. I've served them meals, and people that come behind me, they're like, dude, you're a hard preacher to follow.
Yeah.
And I'm like, why is that? And they're like, they asking me if I can cook. They're asking me if I do this. They're asking me. And I'm like, well, you should be doing something.
That's right.
You know, I
That's a
don't know
good
what
point.
it is, but
Yeah.
what do you do for them other than shake their hand and preach?
Yeah, I've already had people telling me that they're going to go hungry when I leave Indian
Yeah, they
Mission.
will.
They said I could come back to Jubilee, but I have to cook when I
Yeah,
come back.
it's funny that Missy and I joined West Park where I'd served as interim, and Russell Threet's my pastor now, and I was instrumental, and the Lord used me to introduce Russell to the church, and Russell's pastor there now, and I love Russell. But it is funny when we have a business meeting and we have a meal beforehand, and people come up and they go, "Boy, I'm glad to have you back. We've missed your cooking." They tell you stuff like that.
Right.
And but that kind of stuff, those are things they remember.
Yeah.
They don't say we've missed your preaching.
Yeah.
We've missed the fellowship. We've missed the love. And we still have the fellowship, and we still have the meals, and it's still a good time. But I think a pastor needs to be invested in his people.
And I think that's the key. You just said it. It's the love. And that's shown in a lot of different ways, but whether it's cooking a meal, whether it's, digging a ditch, whatever it may be, you're showing those people through your actions and not just through your words that you love them.
Yeah.
And when they know you love them, that's when your preaching will have an effect upon them.
That's right. I remember at Lee Creek, shortly after the family that ran the church tried to fire me and lost and left.
Yep.
And I just went and got a job.
Mm-hmm.
It was supposed to be a full-time job. They wasn't really paying me full-time pay. But I went and got a job at the taxidermy plant.
Oh, yeah.
And started mounting deer heads and whatnot right around the corner from the church. And I didn't say anything to anybody. Mm-hmm. And I just continued to maintain the same ministry schedule and the same commitment to church. And I just added 20 to 25 hours a week of taxidermy work and I voluntarily reduced my pay. And so people were looking at the financial statement. They're like, "Hey man, you ain't been taking all your money." I said, "Well, we ain't got all the people here." Well, when the church grew from that initial hit of people leaving, when the church grew and they had the money, the people in that church was like, "This guy pastored this church for free. We're going to pay him."
Yeah.
I never had to ask them for a raise. Every year I had to say, "No, I've got enough.
Yeah.
No, I don't need any more." Because I had earned that he's willing to do it. He's not here because this is his paycheck.
Right.
He's here because God called him here, and if need be, he'll go work.
Yep.
And I think that's important.
Yeah, it is. Sure it is.
We better get off here. We've already had one preacher come in, tiptoe through here, and we probably have a couple more come in. I need to go back there and heat up that taco meat and
Can't be late for lunch, not with a bunch of Baptist
stir
preachers.
the beans around, make sure the cheese is in a bowl, because if it ain't, they'll get it everywhere.
You stir the beans, I'm going to go back here and stir the pot.
Well, we got several guys that ain't going to be here today, but we got a few new guys coming today, actually.
Good.
Well, they're not new to us. We know them, but first time they've been for a pastor lunch. So.
Well, thanks for having me on, Harold.
Thanks for coming on, man.
enjoyed it.
I hate that you're moving to California, but I'm glad that you're following the Lord's will for your life.
I appreciate it.
And
We're excited about the opportunity. We love the church here. We're going to miss them, but we know this is what God's called us to do. So.
and you've got to go where the Lord calls you to go.
That's it. Yep.
I mean, I love what I do right now.
Yep.
But it's not because I didn't love Lee Creek.
No.
I served them for 14 years.
Yes, sir.
But this was the direction the Lord wanted me to go, and you've got to do what the Lord wants. He called you in the ministry. He sent you to Oklahoma, and he still has the right to send you anywhere else he wants you to
That's
go.
right. You think they'll let me wear my dog shirt and overalls in California?
They might let you. You would probably look as wild out there in that
I'll stick out like a sore thumb.
as they would look out here with their pink hair and chaps with no rear end in them and
Oh, Lord have mercy.
dog chain around their neck. That they would look as wild out here as you would look in that out there. So start a trend, man. Maybe they'll start covering up out there.
Maybe so.
All right. Thank you guys for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you're still listening, I don't know. You may get a special crown in heaven for enduring an hour and 49 minutes of Backwoods Baptist talk. Till then, we'll see you on the next podcast.